sex differences seriously. This talk from the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. is about an hour.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation. I'm John Hilboldt, Director of Lectures and Seminars. We're pleased you could join us in our Lehrman Auditorium. We welcome those who are joining us via the heritage.org website, as well as those who are joining us via C-SPAN. We do ask one courtesy before we begin, if everyone would check that cell phones and pagers are in the off position, as a courtesy to our speaker. And we remind those who are viewing us outside of the building that they may submit questions to us at speaker@heritage.org, speaker@heritage.org, to participate in the question and answer session following today's event. Grounded by our belief in traditional American values, at Heritage we seek to defend, promote, and support the historical role of the family as the basic unit of every civil society. Clearly, as we will see today, understanding the sexual distinctions rooted in our human nature has important implications for formulating and advancing social policy. Hosting our program will be Patrick Fagan. Mr. Fagan is Heritage's William H.G. Fitzgerald Research Fellow in Family and Cultural Issues, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Health and Human Services. Mr. Fagan examines the relationship between family, community, and social problems. He also studies urban policy, the breakdown of the family in America, crime, and cultural issues. Most recently, he has coordinated the development of Heritage's new Family and Society database, located on the web at familydatabase.org. This interactive research tool catalogs social science findings on the family, gleaned from peer-reviewed journals, books, and government surveys. A native of Ireland, Mr. Fagan earned his master's degree in psychology at University College Dublin and is completing his doctoral studies at the American University here in Washington, D.C. It's my privilege to present Patrick Fagan. Pat?
Thank you, John. Well, today we have a most interesting topic, one that's intrigued Homer, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, to go near the top of the list. But despite such company, it now takes courage to address academically that which has always intrigued us naturally, taking sex differences seriously. One of the key purposes of tenure is to give the scholar the freedom to inquire after the truth without fear of being fired. And with tenure comes the fullness of academic freedom, well, sort of today. Political correctness, that form of Marxism that has taken root in America, holds sway in most corridors in the big universities of the country, in what ought to be the freest of institutions in this nation built upon the principle of freedom. Academic freedom has cowed many, or the lack of it actually has cowed many and suppressed much good work, particularly in those myriad aspects of the humanities that touch on family, marriage, sexuality, religion, and ethics. It has transformed the halls of learning into halls of trepidation for those who hold that there are universals to human nature. But not for our speaker today, and actually not too much at his university, Thomas Jefferson's own creation. I first met Dr. Rhoads over lunch in Charlottesville about a year ago and was delighted in hearing his joy in having tenure so that he could write on issues that beckoned, as in the book he has just authored, Taking Sex Differences Seriously, which is published by Encounter Books. Stephen Rhoads has taught public policy at the University of Virginia for over 30 years. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, The Public Interest, and many other publications. His books include The Economist's View of the World, which has Spanish and Chinese translations as well. Incomparable Worth, Pay Equity Meets the Market, was one of his other famous books. Now, for the many interns who may be here, and especially those aspiring to graduate work in political philosophy, I draw your attention to one of the awards that stands out, but the one that really caught my eye. of all the different awards that he's gotten over the last 30 years. Since 1987, he has the annual honor of designating the Bradley Foundation Fellowship for the University of Virginia graduate students. That's $30,000 per year for almost 20 years now. That's prestige with clout in academia. A native of Pennsylvania, he received his bachelor's degree from Princeton and his doctorate from Cornell, and he and his wife have 3 sons and live in Earlysville, just outside Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, following Dr. Rhoads' remarks, we will accept questions from our audience, but right now, the main course, Dr. Rhoads. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pat, and thanks to everybody at Heritage for giving me the chance to sound off on this book. The book argues that masculinity and femininity are not socially constructed. It's not just because the media says we should be a certain way or because parents raise us a certain way that we end up so different. Among other things, the amount of testosterone that we're exposed to in the womb has a lot to do with how we end up, what we care about, and what our personality is like. And attempts to turn poor little boys born without penises into little girls have not been successful. So my argument is that sex differences are real, they're important, and they're consequential. And I want to talk about 3 of them today. Passions or instincts in which there are clear sex differences. First, aggression or competitiveness, then sexuality, and finally, nurturing the young. And I'm going to begin with a cartoon. Although my book's got lots of sights, it's also got lots of cartoons, and this one I like especially because I think it shows the competitiveness of men. It's a Kathy cartoon. Kathy's on the sofa with her boyfriend, and she's feeling very lovey, heart coming out of her head, and saying, well, you've lost 6 pounds on our diet so far, and I've only lost 1. But the important thing is that, and he interrupts and says, I win. And then she says, excuse me, and then he jumps up, I win, yes, I win. And then Kathy gets angry, and in the final panel, he's been kicked out of the house, and as he's walking away, he says, sure, that's what women want. They want us to show open, honest expressions of our feelings. Well, as far as competitiveness is concerned, at the age of 13 months, little boys are more aggressive and they're destroying more things than little girls. And some girls play more like little boys, and it turns out that on average, they have higher testosterone than most girls. As adults, men are much more violent. There are 28 men worldwide who kill another man for every 1 woman who kills another woman. So what do we do about all this excess aggression and testosterone, particularly in men that seem to have an excess of it? And two possibilities. One is to get them married off, because actually getting them married off and having children literally brings down testosterone levels in men, and it brings aggression down. Another possibility is to channel the aggression into sports. You know, one big problem with Title IX is that it's done wonders for women's access to sports, but it's impeded young men's access to sports. And Title IX is misplaced in thinking that men and women, in the absence of societal pressures, would have equal interest in sports. And therefore, what Title IX does is it tends to say there should be an equal proportion of men and women doing intercollegiate sports compared to the number of men and women in the university. But men like sports more. I can only give you 2 pieces of evidence now. Before the age of 2, little boys are playing with balls much more than little girls are. They're doing rough and tumble play much more than little girls are. Little girls like to dance more before the age of 2 than little boys do. When you get to college, anybody who wants to can play intramural sports, but 3 or 4 times as many boys want to play intramural sports as girls. Now, the other problem is that, although I do think men simply like sports more, the other problem is we don't need sports to channel female aggression. We do need sports to channel male aggression. And it's very clear where aggression breeds. It breeds in unsupervised peer groups of young men. This is where aggression breeds. Now, what are sports? Sports are an attempt to take aggressiveness and competitiveness and put it into a supervised, rule-bound environment. Take wrestling, for example. Wrestlers are very tough kids, typically. They're kids who like to spend their days having their face ground into a mat. You know, one side of how tough they are is whenever there's a big wrestling tournament, the Marine recruiters are all over the place. They say, these are our kind of guys. They like to be emotionally and physically miserable. All right, well, what Title IX does is it's led to the demise of more than 60 intercollegiate wrestling teams, and I think we should be sure that wrestlers show their toughness on the wrestling mat so that they're not tempted to show it somewhere else. All right, let me turn to sex. Now, testosterone regulates the male and female libido, and men, of course, have much more than women. Men are more interested in sex than women. A couple signs of this. If you simply ask people how often they think about sex, men will say 3 to 5 times a day, women 2 to 3 times a week, sometimes 2 to 3 times a month. One survey asked adults, male and female, what's really important in your life? You know, religion, how important is it? Religion, your spouse, your kids, your hobbies, your career, and sex. And the biggest difference between the sexes was in sex. The men were much more likely to say it's really important to have an active sex life. Also, men are not just more interested in sex, they're more interested in a variety of partners. And here the media does women no help at all, because you would never guess by looking at Friends or Sex in the City that there's any difference between men and women in how much they like casual sex. In fact, if you look just at the consequences of sex, venereal disease, much more likely if you're a woman to get venereal disease from exposure one time to an infected partner. For HIV, it's 8 times more. My brightest female students don't have a clue about this. If you do get venereal disease, women are much more likely to become infertile. Of course, there's the issue of pregnancy, where the differences are pretty overwhelming. But aside from that, if you just look at how much men and women like casual sex, women don't like it as much. Women who engage in sex, when asked why they do, they usually say things like to share emotions and love. Men give reasons which are much more narrowly physical, such as need for sexual gratification or need for sexual release. And these differences in motivation lead to a lot of unhappy women. One sign of that, if you ask sexually active teens, were you in love with your last sexual partner? The girls say, 71% of the girls say yes. 45% of the boys say yes. If you just asked, do you regret beginning sex as early as you did? Girls much more likely to regret it. If you say, are you happy with your sexual experiences to date? Girls much less likely to say they're happy with them to date. Now, for many young women, there definitely is a period of sexual experimentation, sexual adventure, in which these days they're trying out casual sex. But I think what's interesting, there are good studies that say, look at 250 college undergraduates. They find out the ones who are sexually active. Then they find out the 5 most sexually active women and the 5 most sexually active men and ask much more intensive questions of those. The men are delighted. They're having a ball. The women no longer practice casual sex. They still believe it's fine. They don't have any moral objection to it or religious objection to it, but it just doesn't feel right. Their feelings don't support their beliefs. They're simply not interested in sex with men who are not interested in relationships, it turns out, to their surprise. And, you know, I think that what's going on in casual sex has something to do with a remarkable change in the number of married women these days. If you look in 1960, the percentage of unmarried women was 13%. I should say 40-year-old unmarried women, 13%. In 1999, the same percentage, 29%. 40 years, more than a doubling of the percentage of unmarried women. Now, I think part of that reason is that men are enjoying uncommitted sex much more than women are. And they're thinking, this is fine, but how do I know something better isn't right around the corner and she'll be just as available? So precisely if women want what they say they want, which is a committed, loving relationship and good sex, I think unmarried women should more often say no. Okay, then if we move to nurturing. If men are kind of front and center with aggression and sex, women are front and center with nurturing. Around the world, women are the nurturers. And hormones have a lot to do with that. Estrogen is a nurturing hormone. When women become pregnant, they get big surges of estrogen. Oxytocin, another nurturing bonding hormone. Women have more neural receptors for oxytocin than men do. When they become pregnant, more neural receptors come on. Now take testosterone, the predominantly male hormone. Testosterone inhibits the nurturing of children. If you look at high testosterone women, they're less interested in babies, less interested in young children than average testosterone women. If you look at no testosterone women, they're extremely interested in dolls when they're kids and babies when they grow up, much more so than the average woman. So mothers more than fathers simply find it pleasurable to be around infants and young children. And here's one side of it. Lots of wives complaining with justice that husbands don't do their share of the less attractive part of child care. They love to play with the kid. They'll sometimes want to teach him something, but the more everyday routine stuff they don't seem to like so much. Mothers, of course, do that, and they play. They do everything. So you might say, well, if you ask mothers and fathers, how much do you like parenting? That the fathers would say they like it more. They're doing just the fun stuff. Not so. Mothers say they like parenting much more than fathers say they like parenting. One U.S. study looked at mothers and fathers who specifically said we want to do child care more or less equally. And the fathers and the mothers both agreed that the mothers were more emotionally involved in the children's lives. Another study in Sweden, a study that, a country, of course, that's been trying to meld and blur the difference between motherhood and fatherhood for decades, asked men and women who are going back to work. And they said, how do you feel about going back? The men were much happier about going back to work than the women were about going back to work in Sweden. Another sign of differences, again from Sweden. If you just look at fathers who take leave and say, I want to be the primary caretaker of my infant, and then you send researchers in to observe what happens in those homes, you find that mothers are, in fact, the main nurturers in that home. To quote from one of these studies, the mothers displayed affectionate behavior, vocalized, smiled, tended, held, and soothed the infant more than the father did. If you ask women, mothers, how important on a 10-point scale are your children to your happiness? 86% of women say a 10. If you ask them, if they're also employed, these mothers, and you ask them how important is your job to your happiness, 30% of women say a 10. It's also true that mothers are better equipped to be caregivers than fathers are. Mothers, for example, are better at distinguishing a cry. Is that a cry of anger or of pain or of hunger? They're not just mothers, but women in general are much better at reading body language, reading facial expressions, nonverbal communications. And I think that daycare simply isn't the answer to the modern woman's dilemma. It doesn't get rid of their desire to be with their children. It doesn't get rid of the guilt they feel if they're not with their children. And that guilt is not entirely misplaced. I do think the daycare studies are worrisome. They show that if there's lots of non-maternal care in the first year or two, you look at those same kids when they're in kindergarten, there's almost a 3 times increase in their chances that they'll be aggressive, acting out, seemingly needy kids. If you look at cortisol levels, when boys are in daycare, their cortisol levels are higher than at the same hour on the weekend when they're at home. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Now, having a really important job where you're doing a lot for society is no protection against these feelings of desire to be with a kid and guilt if you're not there. I have several poignant examples of this in my book. I'm got only time to tell you of one, and that's Madeline Kunin, the ex-governor of Vermont, who at the same time she was governor had 4 young children. And she writes an autobiography, and among the things she says is the following: at least once a day, I felt a stab in my chest thinking I should be at one place when I was at another. There was no cure for the anxiety. All I could do was not to let it overwhelm me, not to let it pull me down. Multiple studies show that women who work, mothers who work, are much more stressed than men who work. It doesn't matter whether the kid is in preschool or if he's a teenager. Mothers relative to men are more stressed if they're working. It doesn't matter whether the husband's fully supportive of the career or not. Mothers who work are more stressed. In turn, the children seem to prefer mother in many situations. If you just look at association studies where you look at how many hours the mother's working, the more she works, the worse the kid's grades are. If you look at it with the father in mind, the more the father works, the better the kid's grades are. Similar kind of study looking at, and this one's particularly sad, I think, and genuinely is sad. Women really love their job. Then you look at what's that associated with if you've got a teenage daughter? Worse psychological health. Father really loves her job. Teenage daughter, better psychological health. All in all, I would argue, since mothers don't want to be away from their children nearly as long as having a full-time career requires, because they feel guilty when they're away from their children for long periods, because they're better at being with their children than anybody else is, we shouldn't really expect equal workplace time and equal childcare time for mothers and fathers. If you had equal outcomes, you would not have equal happiness. So this androgynous project, the attempt to have men and women have equal lives, is, I think, fundamentally misogynist, because it doesn't really value what women have historically done as much as what fathers have historically done. Okay, in conclusion, I'd like to say a little about female vulnerability and the modern marriage. Now, I think females are more vulnerable than men in lots of ways. If you take sex, they tend to bond with their partners in a way that men don't. And this can lead to men's more cavalier attitude about sex, can leave many women bitter and emotionally devastated. And then there's pregnancy, delivery, and nursing, and all of which are draining, although they're not unpleasant for women, incidentally. But they're draining, and they may leave the woman in need of being nurtured herself. Then you get to the fact that the woman simply wants to spend more time with the kid, wants to spend lots of time with her child. Can't do that unless the father is being a good provider. So again, a kind of dependency and vulnerability. Indeed, throughout marriage generally, women are more vulnerable in marriage than men are. Studies have looked at this. If there's problems at work, what's the effect on the psychological health of men and women? And it turns out for both of them, it goes down. Then you look at problems in the marriage, what's the effect on the psychological health of men and women? Much further deterioration for women than for men. And some of this stuff is not just psychological, it turns up in physical ways. For example, if a wife thinks the marriage isn't going very well, her blood pressure goes up. If the husband thinks the marriage isn't going very well, his blood pressure doesn't go up. But if the husband thinks the marriage isn't going very well, and the wife must somehow sense this, because we ask him, how's it going? He says, not very well. And then we look at her blood pressure goes up because he thinks it's not going very well. So she gets it both ways. If you look at immune function after an argument, women's immune function goes down further than men's. It stays down longer than men's. Men become distressed in marriage when they feel they're not being good providers and protectors. There's a world-renowned Framingham heart study. This is the one where they looked at the poor citizens of Framingham, Massachusetts, who must be answering questionnaires all the time. For decades, they've been following these same people. And looking at heart health particularly, and what they find is when a wife has an unsupportive boss, her risk of heart attack goes up somewhat. But what's really surprising is when her husband's heart attack risk goes up much more than hers does. So in other words, the wife has an unsupportive boss, and her husbands are keeling over 3 times more often than when the wife doesn't have an unsupportive boss. Now, so the authors try to speculate what's going on here, and I think they're right, and they say they think that what's happening is the men want to be protective. If someone's hassling your wife, you feel you should be doing something about it. What can you do about the fact that she's being hassled by her boss? You can't do anything. And to make it worse, she then tends to come home and want to talk about all the problems at work. And guys don't usually want to talk about problems if they can't do anything about it. So apparently they get angry and frustrated and just dying all over the place. And And this is a study that, as far as I can tell, hasn't been replicated, even though these are enormous percentage differences. I mean, my doctor's so proud of Lipitor knocking down my heart risk by 50%. Here's 300%, and I don't think any of you knew this. All right, fathers also become distressed when their wives have long work hours. They're more depressed, they're less happy with their marriage, they're less happy with their life. And I think the result of the modern two-career family is often angry, exhausted mothers, desperate for a house that looks and feels like a home and for more time with their kids. And that wife's distress brings distress to the husband. Something in him, deep down in him, says she shouldn't be that haggard, she shouldn't be that stressed, she shouldn't have to be working that hard, I must be doing something wrong or she wouldn't look like that. Now, what's the answer? I think in most marriages, the answer has to be, if husbands and wives are to be happier, that the wife cuts back some on her work outside the home, if both are going full bore at the moment. And this is not an insult to women, the farthest thing from it. What I'm arguing really is that men and women can both be good doctors and lawyers, but that women are better nurturers of the young, and they're better at making a house feel like a home. And this is the reason why, in fact, they do, essentially they do two things well. Their husbands do one thing well. So they're going to begin doing more of the thing that only they do well. Now, feminists are going to say that if the woman cut back on their work, they're not going to make as much money, then they're going to lose power in the relationship. Now, there's not good evidence on that, first of all. I can come back to that if you want. But even if it was, is what women want in marriage more power? In fact, we do have good evidence that when women have more power in marriages, the marriages are unusually unhappy. In other words, when women kind of rule the roost, when they get their way most of the time with arguments and so on, we know that those marriages are very unhappy. We also know that the most unhappy people in them are the wife, not the husband. The husband's typically saying, do whatever you want to do. I'll go watch the game, And she can't be happy in a bad marriage. Now, there's another type of power, and here's one that I think women are particularly good at wielding, and which makes for happiness all around. It's a subtler power, a force that creates relationships, binds families, and builds societies. Many of my female students want to have this kind of power. And in fact, if you look around the world, and just ask women and men what kind of person they'd like to be seen as, how they'd like to be described, and even how they see other women, what's characteristic of women as opposed to men, they don't say power. They say, I'd like to be loving, sympathetic, generous. Well, I think we need more power that creates relationships, binds families, and builds societies, and that kind of power comes from people who are loving, sympathetic, and generous. A greater appreciation of this sort of power is partly a cultural issue, but it's also partly a political issue. Because if you just look at our school textbooks, the social science textbooks, even the reading textbooks, you cannot get them approved by state boards of education if they have loving mothers in them. A mother doting on a kid? No way. She's got to have a briefcase, because anybody cooking it better be the husband. And this I think this has a really unfortunate effect on many of my students who are fundamentally home-centered. They'll work sometimes lots of time, but they're going to manage how much they work around what they think the needs of the family are. And I think a lot of these students are a little ashamed of themselves. People keep telling them you're wasting your education, or you could do so much more with your education. And it's really pretty remarkable that they have to put up with this nonsense. And I think we really should more often make it clear that this is a wonderful thing you'd like to do, and try to get the textbooks so that a little more often they see examples of such people living happy, fruitful lives. Okay, I'd love to hear what's on your mind.
Well, we'll take questions now, and before we start the questions, make sure that you wait for the microphone. So put your hands up and make sure you get the microphone so that those listening on television can hear you.
Hi, thank you. I enjoyed the talk. My wife is a non-working mother, and we're a conservative family. Nonetheless, the experience of having small children has given her, how would I say it, it's not simply something that the feminists made up, that there was something
Right.
stultifying about the way of life of a housewife in the 50s and whatever. And you know, I remember when I was growing up, my mother rushing around to do League of Women Voters type things, you know, once we were in school age, certainly. And I agree with you that I think the current dispensation is not progress, but
Right.
weren't there real problems with the older dispensation? Aren't there some problems that can't really completely be solved?
Well, I think that's a very good question. It is true, and this is not a happy circumstance, but usually having children doesn't necessarily improve a marriage. It often makes it somewhat tougher, especially at the beginning. I guess I'd say two things. First of all, I do think it's somehow unnatural for women to be as isolated as they often were in the 50s, you know, raising their kid in their house. And that's all this, the new regime seems to have a lot more play dates at Starbucks and so on that goes with it, which I think is a big improvement, because it gets, women are very social creatures, and it gets them out enabling to talk to other adults. The other thing I guess I'd say is that there's help on the way. In other words, men really are more interested when the kids get over 18 months. The reason I emphasize babies so much is because here the evidence is just overwhelming. I mean, men simply don't feel that baby's communicating in the way a woman does. The woman notices every little gesture, every little sound. It means something to her. The man just says, "What's he doing?" You know? And one sign of this is that men just aren't connecting as well with, it looks like about 18 months is where it changes, and then the man can start playing with the kid and start teaching him something, and he gets much more interested. So there's help on the way if you're talking about kids with babies. But I think one sign that this is different is, you know, a lot, again, going back to the idea that men do the part that's fun and women don't. With babies, men are far more likely to pick up with the dishes in the kitchen than they are in doing the baby care, because they don't really enjoy it very much, and they know that the mother's better at it. And one sign that they're better, again, if you, studies that show who does the kid like to be comforted by, overwhelmingly, even in academia, even with bright, young, politically correct kids, you'll find that the mothers overwhelmingly say that the kid prefers to be comforted by me, not by my husband. But that's also true with play. Usually, if you're talking about a 4-year-old, that rambunctious play style of the man really gets the 4-year-old excited. He loves that. But for babies, not so. With babies, the mother is preferred to play. She's more sensitive. You know, the guy's got his own agenda. Hey, do this, do this. You know, she's just not picking up on where they are, and she's just much more sensitive to where that baby is. So, in any case, I think, you know, I didn't say women shouldn't work at all. I said that women, I think there are very few women who are happy with a 1-year-old at home if they're working 50 hours a week. Very, very few.
Yes. I forgot to ask, when you get the microphone, would you identify yourself and your affiliation? Thanks.
Scott Bennett, Department of Health and Human Services. In the good old days, we used to have charm schools, which would teach young women how to practice and develop characteristics of allure and character and things that facilitated healthy attraction and healthy relationships and healthy marriages. What sort of practical steps and behavioral and character traits could you encourage young women today to begin to revisit and redevelop to develop a healthier sense of their own worth and being, to attract and develop better men?
Yeah. That's another very good question, I think, because it really is a question of better men to some degree. I really think men are kind of the disaster these days. You don't have to tell many 21-year-old girls that. I mean, if they're in college, the guys are just, you know, they're aside from the fact they're only interested in sex, they're also juvenile. They just have no reason to grow up because they're having a good time. You know, why not stay a teenager? What's the point of growing up? And I do think that women, you know, in fact, they do, as I said, when men get married, they tend to settle down and get careers and take that aggression and that energy in the career direction. I think, you know, a lot of it depends on what you find charming, and still there are lots of women who still charmed by Jane Austen, and so more and more Jane Austen. But I do think the part of the problem is an androgynous sex education. It really is. I mean, just this idea that so few of my women know about the fact that they're much more susceptible to VD. Because the idea is everybody should get the same message, and the woman should, if I tell the woman they're more susceptible, I'm really telling the man, hey, you're not very susceptible. You know, we don't want to do that. So it has to be the same message supposedly for everybody. We can't say men seem to like casual sex because, hey, we don't want them to know they like casual sex. They know they like casual sex. I mean, you know, really, it's not everybody. And if the guy is religious and serious about his religion, it may be entirely different. But they're much more likely to like casual sex. So it's not a question of telling him. In fact, what I think the answer is, it partly is knowing that, the fact that it's peers, for example, have much more influence on the girl's sex life than they do on the boy's sex life. And I think we really have to just tell women the truth, which is, look, I know you're reading in the Washington Post style about a lot of women who seem to be having a great time with casual sex. I'm waiting for the first reporter to go talk to them, say a 23-year-old woman, and say, tell me how much sex you had when you were 18 and how you feel about it now. That's my point. Not to say for a period of time they think, hey, this might be really fun. I'm saying in the long run, they don't seem to think it's fun. Presumably these 5 most sexually experienced women were the ones who were most attracted to it, most into it. All of them now reject it. So just getting facts out like that, I think, and making it clear to women, you know, you really are different than the man is. You're going to feel differently about that. You want something different from romance. Now, the only way to reach men, I think, is to remind them that women are really different. Because if they got a decent character, the best way is to say, you know, you probably won't be unhappy about this, but you know you're leading a lot of these women on, that you're not as interested in them as they are in you. And that's not a very nice thing to do, is it, to leave people with broken hearts? So, you know, play to some degree on their conscience, I think. And, but realize it really has to be working on the women in a different way than the men, just telling them what the real facts of life are, I think.
Patterson, Administration of Children and Families. Dr. Rhoads, in your research, have you uncovered any connection between the decline in marriage rates and the androgenization of the sexes? I mean, is there a connection between what we've seen in the last 20 years of minimizing sexual differences and the decline of marriage in America?
I haven't seen much on that, but it's certainly an intriguing proposition, because we do know that there's something about, we do know that, for example, when there's defined roles in marriages, those are stronger marriages. You know, and I know lots of social scientists always want to get everybody doing the same thing, but then they have to admit, well, when you have a division of labor, there's stronger marriages. So, in fact, what they try to do is come up with, well, we don't have to have it all the same way. Maybe sometimes the man will be the nurturer and the mother will be out in the work, but there has to be a division of labor, or at least that seems to be associated with stronger marriages. So that suggests that a movement toward androgyny would move in that direction. I also think that love is connected, sexual love, romantic love, marital love is connected with difference. There's good evidence of this. There's a nice study by Pepper Schwartz, a strong feminist, called Peer Marriages, where she finds these marriages where everybody's trying to do everything the same. And she finds that, first of all, she's a defender of them. She says a lot of people feel as a matter of principle it should be this way, that's what equality means, and so on, and they're living a certain way. But she also says there's some problems. One thing, they fight about raising the kid all the time, because it's, you know, they're supposed to do it half and half, and they don't agree about how it should be done. And more intriguingly is they don't have much of a sex life. She says a lot of them, you know, we kind of see each other more as kind of roommates, partners, and we don't really get around to having sex very much.
They had more sex before marriage than after.
Yeah, well, yeah, and they even have, Pepper Schwartz even has quotes in there which are just amazing. I think if I can remember some of them. One of it is, I just wish sometimes he'd be less respectful. You know, he's talking about sex life. You know, act as if he really wants it. Come here, I want to have sex. And not be, oh, how would you feel? It's just, the whole thing just seems, I gather, even from Pepper Schwartz's study, somehow unmanly and therefore unattractive to women. So I have a hunch that there's something there, but I haven't seen much evidence on it.
Stephanie Smith, I'm a former student. You touched on the idea of sort of power roles and sort of power play between women and men. Right. I was wondering if you could expand on that as far as women in the workplace rather than in the home.
Yeah, you mean how women, how effective they are in the workplace, and what kind of styles effective in the workplace? The
implications of sort of your idea of two different styles of power.
Yeah, well, you could look at either the personal level or, in fact, at the workplace power. And I do think that you can overdo the idea that it takes an aggressive person to be successful in work. It also takes a cooperative person to be successful at work, and people who read other people well. And women are better at reading men than men are at reading women. We've got good studies on that. And that incidentally gives them a good bit of power in relationships, doesn't it? If you can kind of read your spouse better than he's reading you, it's a way of mitigating his superior strength. And I think that as far as, there's lots of ways that there are problems with it. Just something like sexual harassment. You can't understand sexual harassment with an androgynous outlook, I don't think. If you ask a man, how would you feel if a woman came up to you and said, hey, let's go out at lunch and have some sex? He says, well. If you ask him, would you be flattered or offended or what? He's much more likely to say, I'd be flattered. I don't know what I'd do, but it certainly wouldn't be an insult. But if you ask a woman, how would you feel if a man came up to you and said, hey, let's go out to lunch and have some sex? Overwhelmingly, they feel it's an insult. So you have a very different dynamic as far as how men and women interact there, and it's not at all androgynous.
Mark Adams with the Culture of Life Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Talking about sort of these biological instincts or tendencies, are there also good biological instincts in men? I know for myself.
Yeah. Right.
I know for myself that certainly part of me, you want casual sex, you're looking at girls, but then there's, as one that was just recently married, I know that part of me also loved standing in front of all these people and saying, I make this commitment forever and ever, no matter what she does, I'm standing beside her. And I know I have other friends, my own age, male friends, who feel the same way about marriage. They're excited that I'm going to take care of this girl forever.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because I think one thing that men need more civilization more than women do. That's why women have to civilize men. That doesn't mean aggression is always bad. We want aggressive Marines, and as long as there are aggressive people brutal people running other countries, you're going to need some guys with some toughness. And women too. Some women have toughness, just a whole lot more men of the kind you need if you're going to be in the military. But I think, what men do particularly well is they have a real sense of duty. One of the studies I like most is that if you ask in marriages, it's not going all that well, but if you ask, how would your spouse feel if this marriage broke up? It turns out that the husbands are more likely to keep the marriage going for that reason, because they think it would really be devastating for my wife, than the other way around. Wives are somewhat more cavalier about saying, I'm just not happy in this marriage. It's going to be awful for him, but I want a divorce. So I do think men have a sense of duty, and I do think, therefore, this idea of there's almost no religion in the book, but in some sense, it supports much of what the Bible says about male headship. Because if you just think about what men are like, they've got these big egos, and part of the problem with men these days is if women are half the provider, there's no way the men are going to be half the nurturer. At best they're going to be assistant moms. So they go from head of the family to kind of less than half, and that doesn't make men feel very good. So, but I think just simply saying that you really are the head of the family and you're going to have more power. You're physically stronger. After all, I mentioned that women like to be generous and sympathetic and nurturing. If you ask men what they like to be seen as, they say assertive, independent, powerful. You know, you put somebody who says, I want to be generous in a marriage with someone who says, I want to be powerful. You know, watch out. You gotta be sure that the man has a understanding of the world, an understanding of life that says, but that power has to be used for the good of your family, for the good of your wife and for the good of your family. And I think that message does bring out the beneficial side of man's sense of duty in a way that's very helpful. Yes, sir. Yes.
I'm an intern here at the Heritage Foundation. How do you think the effort to androgynize the sexes and to blur the natural differences between them has been affected over the last 50 years by the rise of artificial contraception, insofar as that is really an effort to take away natural consequences of these differences between the sexes?
Well, that's one that I do think, well, first of all, you know, it is problematic just physically. I mean, you're probably aware of the evidence that shows that the babies simply aren't on average as healthy when they're born in that situation. Of course, it can only go in one direction, right? I mean, it's the man you can get rid of. You still need a woman. I'd say, you know, it's a little problematic in this sense that, I mean, I don't get into the whole issue of homosexuality except in the most tangential ways, and I don't really want to get into that now because I don't know as much about it as a lot of people around Heritage do. But I do think that that there's an issue about whether you do. I've said a lot about why we need mothers and why they're good nurturers. We really need fathers too. As I've got a chapter on fatherless families in the book. I think it's the most overwhelming evidence of anything in the book. I just got so sick and tired after a while of reading more evidence that how much worse fathers do without the biological, how much worse kids do without the biological father in the house, that I just said, enough. I mean, how many footnotes do I need? Why is it that they do so much? First of all, I think they control young men. Young men are much more likely to be delinquent, much more likely to be delinquent if there's not a biological father in the house. And this is why the artificial insemination comes up. It has to be the biological father. A stepfather doesn't really help much. We also know that having two loving people, a mother and a grandmother, doesn't help very much. And so they're really great with the men, and I think they're really helpful with the women as far as sexuality is concerned. I think if the father's around and he's treating his mother right, the daughter's far more likely to say, that's what I'm holding out for, and not try to attract men through her sex. So it's not quite your answer, but I don't really have the answer to your specific question. You know.
My name is Kurt Bennett. I'm a retired Marine.
All right. Ex-wrestler?
Yeah. Do that to my son. I had a question with the different paradigm shifts in society and communication, where you get nuclear families with women who are almost forced by economics to go out and get a job to help make a mortgage payment so she can afford together in this family. The paradigm of how to survive and exist in an ever-changing world. And it seems like the marriage model or the marriage paradigm doesn't shift. If anything, you're trying to kind of hold it stable or keep it even when everything around it is continually changing, continually evolving. And I'm just curious, is there anything that can be stabilized and not be a victim of the continuous aggressive shifting that every day we wake up to a new world, and how do we adjust to it? How do we just stay even? How do we tread the water with an institution that, if anything, is a little bit behind everything else? Just curious.
Right. Well, I hope this doesn't sound too insensitive, because I think it will to a lot of readers. But in the book, I make this point. Because there's some really wild quotes that feminists have about how it used to be in the 50s you could survive on one income, but you can't do that now. To put food on the table, you need two incomes and so on. And I don't doubt that there are families that are like that, but not the families that read books and write books, not the upper middle class families. I mean, look, here are the facts. The facts are that in the 50s, the average, I mean, the median male income was 30% less than it is now, just the male. Now, and I'm talking about the same dollars. In other words, I'm talking real dollars, what you can purchase with the income. So we are 30% richer than our parents were in the 50s who managed to get along with one income. And we're the richest country in the world. And to be going around saying, you know, boy, no way we can afford it now, is a sign of saying we are really materialistic. Okay, well, we are. So what I'm saying is, I think a lot of women are doing this anyway. I mean, and I read stuff saying the men feel like it's bait and switch. You know, they get this $150,000 lawyer they're marrying, and after 2 years she has a kid, she wants to quit. You know, where'd that come from? You know, and but the point is that I think if we understood better that women really are not going to be very happy with a young child if they're working as hard as they have to work as to get law partner, they're just not going to be happy, and therefore you're not going to be happy, then I think we would say, well, what do we really need? I mean, one of the reasons that mortgage is so big is our houses are mammoth compared to the 50s. You know, do we really need houses that are that big? And the only thing I'm asking, I'm not trying to tell anybody how to live their lives, because there are no doubt women out there, and I think on average they have high testosterone, incidentally, who really are just too much energy, too much go-go in them to be happy spending as much time with a child as a homemaker would. I'm not telling anybody how to live. I'm just saying that on average, the studies show that you're going to do, if part of what you're thinking is, well, I could send him to Europe if I worked, or I could give him her dance lessons if I worked, or I could do something extra, and that's on one part of the scale, and the other part of the scale is I could spend so much more time with him if I didn't work. The evidence shows that time's a whole lot more important than the extra things you can buy. You know, I think we've now got evidence, Pat, in a way we didn't have 20 years ago, that that's the case. So I just say, you know, everybody look at their own situation, how their own personality interacts with work and childcare, but realizing if they're on the tipping scale, if it's a close call, they could be reasonably happy going either way. Your kid's probably going to be happier, and probably your marriage is going to be happier if you went in the cut back somewhat way rather than plunging ahead. Because after all, we have a long life. You know, you don't have to, the kids won't be young forever, is part of what I would say as a part of that message.
Maybe we could take the next to last question. We've had a lot of men asking questions.
They're more aggressive.
Hi, my name is Christine McGrath, and I'm with CFAM and Culture of Life Foundation. You'd mentioned the notion of a wasted education in motherhood,
right.
And I'm just curious what you would say to someone who would suggest that a graduate degree, you know, something of that nature, would be wasted in motherhood.
If she's really worried about, would it be wasted?
Well, I guess either whether that's already been pursued or whether pursuing one, knowing that the end would be that person wanted to be a full-time mother. I think there can be a lot of challenges from others looking for the utility of that degree, saying, you know, well, that would be such a waste, to, you know, to put that much time and effort and financial burdens. Right.
Well, I think I'd probably say something different if they were going on psychology or accounting. You know, I mean, although accounting's actually not bad to have a home and do some accounting from a home office. So I suspect that what I would probably say is, you know, this is just a part of your life, and if you think you would like to have a career, do what women have always done and still do, and that is to say, think about careers that are easier than most at mixing with being home for a large part of your life. And so, I mean, I do think that, after all, if you're studying in the liberal arts, if you're studying psychology, if you're studying nursing, if you're studying a lot of things, it'll make you a better mother as well as a better worker. And, you know, so if accounting's a bad one, what would be a bad example? What would be a good one? I mean, if you really think you want to be a homemaker, then think about whether this is a job where if you get it and you succeed in it, you're traveling a lot. Probably doesn't make a lot of sense. I know it's hard. I mean, I think one of the things that is really hard is for women these days, especially, I talked about how miserable the men look like as future mates to them, and they don't really realize that they can make these guys better and that they do get better than they look when they get married. But, you know, a lot of my students are, I got better things to do to make these men better, you know. And so they've been hurt, and they got a lot of bitterness and so on. But you really will make him better if you play your cards right. And he'll be happier married than he is now. Happier than, men's happiness goes up a whole lot. They just don't know it, and they don't rush into it. And so I'd say go ahead and go with that thought, which is kind of drifted away in my dotage here, I think. I don't think I ended that answer very well, but I don't think I can do better. So let's go to the last question. I may be running out of steam or something.
Actually, I'm going to ask the question I'm sure is on many people's mind.
Yeah.
You're now President of the United States, or you have the whole world in front of you.
Right.
What would you do? Given all that you've researched, the debates you've been in, what are the big corrections that if you had the wherewithal and nobody would oppose you, you think would be very wise to introduce?
Well, the reason I don't think it should be controversial is a lot of these things are just facts. I mean, this is a facts-filled, lots of anecdotes. I think it's a pretty fun read, but it's filled with studies and results that I think would be helpful just to get out there, so everybody knew what we're dealing with. The other thing is, you know, the fatherless families thing. Another way to reach men is I don't think men realize how important they are to their kids. You know, they say, well, I'll try to keep in touch. I'll try to see them on weekends. In fact, this doesn't happen. And I think that if they knew, you know, it really is your presence that seems to be crucial. That men, and I think women who, after all, file for most of the divorces would feel differently too. I mean, if women love those kids so much, if they really were convinced that this divorce will really hurt them, I think that they would be less likely to get divorced. And I also think they should have other kinds of studies. I know you're aware of, Pat, and that's this amazing stuff from Linda Waite, sociologist at the University of Chicago, showing if you look at really unhappy marriages, and then 5 years later, an amazing number of those have become happy. So it really does seem to be the case. There are bad patches in marriages, and if you just see it through, things will get better lots and lots of time. So do that, and of course I would say Title IX really needs reforming. Now that's not maybe the biggest issue in the world, but it really is unfair to men. I mean, 60 Minutes has this show where the female athletic director at the University of Maryland is asked, what do you tell these wrestlers when you tell them they can't come out for the team anymore? Now Maryland still has a team, but the numbers crunch means that the wrestling scrubs can't practice anymore because that makes their team too big. This tells us something right there. Men have the big egos. Why are they more willing than women to sit on the bench? I think it's a way they bond with other men that women get through conversation. And they're willing to sit on the bench, and we're not even letting them do it, even though they don't cost any money, because it ruins the numbers. And this female athletic director says, well, what do they do when I tell them? A lot of them cry. And men don't cry very often. Tough wrestlers don't cry very often. And when you tell them they can't get their face rubbed in the mat anymore, they cry. So I'd say Title IX is important. Daycare is important. There's a book, you know, there's a problem because psychologists are very liberal on family issues. But I think that they've come up with a method of finding out what's really happening. And I think you'd have to say that daycare proponents have to be more cautious about it if they know the literature than they were 20 years ago. But generally, just say it's not so bad to have, you know, a society have its motto be viva la difference. You know, both sexes have a lot going for them, and they complement each other if it works well. And I think it will work better if women didn't expect men to be like their female friends, and men didn't expect women to be like their male friends. If they really realize you're dealing with something different here, it's part of the reason you're attracted to it, and she really does care if that place is picked up. You thought you picked it up, but she doesn't, and she's got to live here too, so why not try a little harder?
Well, our applause has already given Dr. Rhoads some idea of our appreciation. It's great what he has started. I think he has started something that is going to be very exciting because you're grounding yours in the data and in the research. And those who don't agree with you have to come back and trump you from the data, if they can. And I look forward to what's going to happen there. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We will have some refreshments outside. Also, the book is on sale at a very significant discount, and there'll be the authors here will sign for you too. We thank Encounter Books for coming along. So please join us for refreshments outside. Thank you very much, and good day.
Stephen Rhoads teaches public policy at the University of Virginia. Taking Sex Differences Seriously is published by Encounter Books on the web at encounterbooks.com.